Welcome, everybody. All right, today we're talking about stubborn people. Yes. So we're going to break it down just psychologically, and then we're going to go into all kinds of other stuff regarding stubborn people. So psychologically, stubbornness is a defense mechanism, and it's rooted in anxiety, which is correlated to fear. And it's a desire to protect your ego, and it's a need for control. And it often stems from an inability to tolerate the discomfort of being wrong, leading people to rigidly stick to familiar habits rather than risk the unknown. And to be with somebody like that is absolute misery. These people are horrible, horrible people to have to coordinate with. But unfortunately, there are a huge, vast amount of these creatures in this world that are married, breeding, have jobs, and infect people's lives all over the world, and affect people's lives all over the world. Psychologically, it also reframes this trait depending on how it's directed. When channeled productively, it transforms into persistence and resilience, which is a good thing. That can be a great quality about stubborn people. It also can drive focus, it helps people achieve long-term goals, and it is correlated to survival and resiliency. And so that in itself can be a good thing. So stubbornness can have a positive affect to it. The problem is if you lean into it too heavy as a part of your character and keep reinforcing, well, I'm a stubborn person, you're going to be a pain in the ass to deal with in this life. And people are going to be happier than sad to be around, to not be around you. But the root cause is often a reaction to perceived threats. And that's a very important thing to understand. Signaling a deep-seated fear of vulnerability or past experiences that taught someone they could only rely on themselves. And also, cognitive dissonance and confirmation bias is a big deal because the brain dislikes when new evidence contradicts deeply held beliefs. And to avoid the mental discomfort, which is called dissonance, the changing of their minds, stubborn people often subconsciously filter out new data to justify their original narrative. That's called confirmation bias. So, what is this? Confirmation bias is like this: I think you are a bad person. So, you and I are having a conversation, and me thinking you're a bad person, I'm going to filter everything you do and everything you say and every tone that you have to correlate back to the fact that I'm right, that you're an evil person. Now, that means I'm only listening for about 2% of what you actually say and do. So I'm just filtering it through the confirmation that I'm right. This is what stubborn people do. They have a lot of confirmation bias. They have a lot of beliefs that they are right and other people are wrong. They oftentimes have a justification of that, and everything they hear through everybody in the world that falls into the I reject you mode, they tend to confirm that only what they say, only the little bits of what they say is going to confirm their belief in that person. There's also obstinance versus persistence. That's another element that operates with stubbornness. Obstinacy is refusing to change your mind, even even when presented with better facts. While persistence, it's often called grit, is the healthy refusal to give up on a goal despite your challenges. Now, persistence is a good thing, but obstinacy, even when you're presented with better ideas and a better way to go, means you can't learn. You can't evolve. You're stuck where you are. And that's where stubborn people get into a lot of trouble, especially when it involves being in a relationship. If you find yourself struggling with to navigate these kind of tendencies, either within yourself or with a closed off partner or a colleague, learning to recognize why your heels are dug in makes a huge world of difference. Becoming more aware of your own stubbornness and your own qualities of this is a huge thing. And many people Know they are stubborn and embrace it as a charming quality. I'm sorry, it's ugly. It's a horrible quality to have if you weigh into it as a major part of your character. When you think about someone stubborn, chances are you attribute their unwillingness to blend their personalities. And they may be arrogant, narcissistic, or just plain contrarian, but they want everything to come to them. They don't want to come to you. They don't want to compromise. They want everything to come to their desires, their needs, and their wants. And some people have blown so much smoke up their own ass that that's all they can do is make everybody come to them. But in many cases, it's something about the way their traits line up that causes them to be so rigid. What if it wasn't a personality at all? It's possible that people who seem to be stubborn just are unable to take in all the relevant data from the situations in which they find themselves. They're not objective enough to look at all of the data. They just want to look at all of the data that confirms what they want to believe. And perhaps they let their internal assessment override the information that more flexible people can use to guide their behavior. You know, there was a paper back in 2017 in London at the University of London, and it analyzed basically the tendency for people to engage in top-down processing, in which people base expectations about what will happen on their own previous experiences. So your brain learns to be stubborn in this sense because it needs to guide your actions in the most efficient way possible. And so it's called predictive coding. And so it suggests that we infer the most likely state of the outside world by minimizing prediction errors about its contents. Ideally, the brain updates its predictions based on what happens and what sometimes it doesn't happen. So, for instance, if you're going to go and visit a certain location of certain culture of people, you may go with the belief that they're going to be this kind of behavior. I'm going to see these kind of things, and that's what you're going to look for in that culture. Unfortunately, you may not look for the gentler parts of that culture. You're only looking for the specific things to confirm your bias. Stubborn predictions are resistant to learning, and that is the truth. And if you, and therefore, they play a role in psychological disorders and depression. Depression is a huge one that stubbornness plays into because you have lots of expectations and nobody is meeting them, including yourself. Stubbornness is all about expectations of negative things from people, predicting catastrophes. That's where stubbornness comes in. And it's really important. People who view their situations as, confirming the negative biases they hold about their self-worth, they'll continue to regard even good experiences as evidence that people don't like them. Now, how does this weird predictive coding operate? Well, if you take the approach to the next level, you will understand that people can be successful at explaining low-level perceptual abilities and the new neural processes that underlie them. So when you're unsure about how to interpret, if you're unsure and unable to see the details of a visual display, such as where, a glass is or where a certain thing is located, your brain fills the blanks. So it fills in what it believes should happen, things should look like. So it will fill in the gaps for you. And when prediction errors fail to lead people to adjust their expectations, they're left with stubbornness. So you may say, hey, that glass was not there yesterday. And you may believe that the glass was there yesterday. I didn't move that glass. That glass was there. I know it was there because I've never moved it. So it was always there. Well, somebody may have moved the glass. But since that person believes that it is there, they filled in the gap that the glass is where they think it is. And that's where stubbornness comes in. That's the quality of stubbornness. When you try to see things differently, you have to operate within a world to understand that people perceive things differently. People's truths are all different, which means that you are Socratic. You are in relationships with people. Stubborn people are not in relationships. They're in a relationship with confirming what they believe. They're not in a relationship with other people. Now, if you want to be healthy, what is good for people is to understand the idea that, hey, I want to hear your perception. I want to hear what your truth is. I want to hear how you saw things. You see, and that's a very important quality to be able to be willing to interact with people, validate their perception without the need to agree, even. But the fact is, you're taking in the world consultatively because we all see the world from our sensory perceptions, and each of them is tuned in differently at any given moment. The stubborn people like rituals also. Those associated with cultural traditions, they hard bake those things. So holidays can be a real pain in the ass with stubborn people because if you do any variables, they feel like they've lost their holiday. They feel like you've destroyed their holiday because they did not have their traditional whatever that they had to have for that particular day. And they bake those, they hard bake things into who they are. They don't like change. And there's almost a fear of change with stubborn people you know? And maybe you suggest, like in a ritual, that you spend a holiday at a vacation spot instead of a home. Maybe you have a different kind of meal than you normally have. Maybe you skip Thanksgiving dinner this year because you're on a diet. How could you even suggest that? Because with stubborn people, they want it their way. They want it, we've always done it this way. They find comfort in permanency. And there's a thing in psychology called object permanence. What is that? Well, if you think about a blanket, when you're a child, you may attach to that blanket and you always grab that blanket when you feel unsafe. Stubborn people hold on to their blanket quite often. They have that stuffy toy that they have to have all the time. That's where their stubbornness comes in. They persistently need comfort in things being constant. And that may have to do, it may have a psychological principle to it of attachment, that maybe they have a fear or some kind of issue around attachment. And that's highly possible. It's not that easy also to avoid stubborn predictions. Given the universality of routines and norms and shared cultural activities, the challenge is more difficult by the finding that some of the brain's top-down activities start in sensory areas that are very important, that call for certain processing. So on Thanksgiving, you may need to smell that apple pie, or you may need to smell that turkey being cooked, or you may need to watch the same movies that you watch every year. Whatever those things are, stubborn people hold on to those things like they're Fort Knox. All right, we're going to take a break. We're going to come right back. Welcome back, everybody. All right, we're talking about stubborn people. Yes. The visual cortex is downstream of the frontal cortex. So the frontal cortex is in the very front of your brain. The visual cortex is a little bit lower. And the expectations that build up based on visual experience can start right there instead of having to travel upward. They're faster than even the frontal cortex. Therefore, in emergencies that demand immediate attention, keeping that glass from falling on the ground In either case, you may decouple imaginary worlds by focusing on your visual. And if you focus on your visual may take precedence over your thought. You know, we also have to employ creativity to overcome stubbornness. You know, if stubbornness is so hardwired into your circuits of your brain, shaking those circuits up through exposure to new ideas and imaginative activities can be the remedy. You might not get to that vacation spot for the holiday, but just thinking that things don't always have to be the same from year to year can give you a little experiential play space. And that is a very important thing to do for stubborn people. Shake it up. How about dealing with stubborn people whose personality underlies their rigidity? You know, taking them to a museum or a concert probably will not provide a permanent fix. However, you know, you can get at least realize that the problem may be uh, one involving the way they use their experiences to confirm their beliefs. You know, if I go there, there's going to be a bunch of crazy progressives there. I don't know if I want to go there because people like this go to that game. You know, I have a stubbornness, I guess, because I don't want to go to any WNBA game now that they're all a bunch of psychopaths attacking fans for having a different point of view that actually women should play in women's sports. How weird is that to even have to communicate that people are that stupid that women should play in women's sports, men should play in men's sports? God, how stupid is this human race? How delusional is our society that they want to make laws to affirm their delusions? I mean, how sick, how far, how stupid is our world to want that? Anyway, it's not always fun to have a debate with someone whose views are baked into their brain. And we all have that. As you can see, I do for some reason and some aspects. And you're also likely to face a great deal of blowback, some of which may be highly personal and insulting, like they attack your own less than traditional views on life. However, you know, it may be possible to shift things a little with counterfactual scenarios and unconventional narratives encountered in worlds, you know, in the what if thinking in a fictional world. In your imagination, thinking of a counterfactual scenario may help people think about events that have happened from a slightly different perspective. You know what's really interesting is you can be in a conversation with somebody that has a completely different perspective on you. I can be in a conversation, and I do have conversations constantly with people that are highly progressive, weirdo, liberal, crazy. I don't agree with everything they have to say, but what I come to find is there is some really human traits in these people. There's some really common sense in these people. There's some areas of their life that is really, 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 really good. But what some of their ideals, some of their projections on society may be very delusional and very unsafe for the rest of the human race. But them as people, they may have some really great qualities, you know, and that's what we all have to embrace. We all have to understand that we are very gray as individuals. We have many depths, many things, and we have to also accept the fact that we may not agree with everything that other people do, but we can actually take an interest in what other people do. You know, the brain's constant search for sameness can be highly adaptive. You know, turning that search into one for novelty, at least some of the time, can really pave an even more adaptive path towards tuning into new experiences. Now, some people have to completely prepare for new experiences, like plan a vacation a year in advance and then go on their vacation. I do that sometimes. So the bottom line is that, you know, as we as people, we have to decide, okay, I'm going to be experiential now. I'm going to experience some things. I'm going to take some things in that are not used to. And getting into that state of mind, it may, for stubborn people, be very, very hard. Most of us know what a stubborn person acts like, but, you know, we also have to understand what it looks like. You know, having to show dogged determination not to change one's attitude or position on something, especially in spite of good arguments or other reasons, That's a stubborn person. You know, you get all these people that are dug in on the progressive and the liberal side and the Democratic side. They all hate Trump so much, but the fact is, they all are just like him as human beings. As human beings inside themselves, they want the power that he has, but they don't have it because they're too stupid or too weird or too whatever. But they want that ego. They want that place that he represents something inside them they just can't stand. And so they project it all on him because they can't look inside themselves. You know, it's difficult to remove, or cure people that are stubborn. People that are stubborn won't go to the doctor even though their heart may be hurting. And there's signs that they're having a heart attack or signs that they're sick. They're too stubborn to take care of themselves. They have an ego. They have an image that they have to hold up no matter what the cost. And there's not doubt a stubborn person can be challenging to work with. These people can be so rigid. And you know, working with these kind of people can be very, very hard. But what you want to do is you want to give them the other side. You know, if you thought more down the path of, you know, what your kid needs, or if you thought that what would be good for everybody, it might be a little different than what you're thinking of for yourself. You know, because these people really hang on to what they think is going to work. Stubborn is not always a bad quality, though. For example, you know, a officer who's stubborn about not taking shortcuts is a very effective training officer. You know, they're especially if it's in law enforcement or fire, which is a very, very high expectation field where you've got to perform great detail. You know, if you're in a field like that and you're in a job that calls for obstinacy and persistence, you need to do that. But stubbornness is just flat out stupid. You know, another cause of stubborn behavior comes from being set in your ways. You know, old people get like this. We are creatures of habit and we can gain comfort in doing things a certain way. And any recommendation to do things outside the zone of comfort may be met with resistance or refusal. You know, for stubborn, the mantra may be, why change? What I'm doing is working well for quote unquote me. You know, there are a lot of stubborn people who breed and have children. But they won't go play with their children. They want to do what they like to do. They like to do, I'm not very good at playing. I'm not very good at talking to kids. I don't like kids. Blah blah blah. But they'll breed. They love to breed. And they want to be a dad or, you know, want to be a parent, but they're stubborn. And so they get stuck in their ways. And these people have no business being the breeding stock that they are to go out there and breed because if you're a stubborn person, you're going to limit your child into your stupid, stubborn habits. You know, the stubborn nature of someone may come with the feeling of comfort for them, but it's not necessarily comfort for other people. Stubborn people lack empathy. Stubborn people lack the ability and the education and the knowledge and the desire to understand more than one side of an argument. Suggesting a change can cause a disagreement and discomfort. Stubborn people argue about nothing. They argue about their own need for comfort. And it's really sad because they argue instead of try to understand. You know, the fear of change and the fear of consequences from failure are powerful motivators towards resisting new ideas. One of the best ways to reach a stubborn person is to employ a principle. And we actually, Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People was really good for this. Seek first to understand and then to be understood. The listener is in charge of the conversation, but if you are a quiet listener and don't validate and don't track with people, you're not a good listener. You're just a quiet asshole. So, what you want to be is a person who validates what other people think and what other people feel and be a part of a conversation. Stubborn people are often very quiet and they are resilient in their own ideas of what they want, and they don't communicate what they want unless somebody really forces them out of their comfort zone, and then they're going to force everybody to fall back into their comfort zone and do what they want because their safety and their comfort is more important than the entire world. The principle of first understand, then to be understood has worked well for many, many people in the human race. And prior to using this principle, many people are very quick to judge and they're quick to make sure other people understand your perspective, but you don't care about other people's perspective when you're stubborn. All you care about is I'm right and you're wrong. That is not intellect. That is not a smart person. If you call yourself stubborn, you're also calling yourself stupid. It's simple as approaching a person as saying, why are you so stubborn? Wow. Now you're going to get a real asshole response from them. Well, not, you could take that approach, but it's very likely that the stubborn person is going to be very defensive and your hopes of making any headway is going to die right there. You're not going to have productive communication with stubborn people when you confront them on their stubbornness. So, what you want to do is ask open ended questions that allow you to understand the stubborn person's point of view first, because they don't care about anybody else's point of view but their own. So, what you want to do is have some empathy. You know, what makes you feel this way? How did you come about with this idea that this is important? That's not a bad way to ask a question because what you're trying to do is pry them open. And hopefully what you want to lead to is frustration and distrust in their own idea that maybe there are better ways to do things. If they're not ready to talk, give it a little time, try approaching in a different way. But if you're going to marry stubborn people, holy cow, what a miserable life. These turds are awful, awful human beings. You need therapy. It's terrible to be married to stupid people. And as you seek to understand as a human being, rather than be understood, you may learn a great deal about what drives other people and actually how to have the thing that stubborn people want more than anything, which is real and deep relationships. They do want to have that, but their technique of stubbornness makes them unapproachable because they don't want to understand anybody else but themselves. And they want to make damn sure you understand everything about what they believe. What you want to do, if you want to seek to understand, is think of a person you would describe as stubborn, and think about a strategy to understand their perspective. That's the first approach you want to take with a stubborn person. You also want to assume that a stubborn person may be scared, and chances are they're not going to admit they're scared, but they don't like change. And that is a fear that is underneath them. Also, you want to discuss the things that they're stubborn about. Chances are you'll see your point of view as the right perspective. It's all part and parcel of stubborn. What can you do to be more approachable to the ideas of others? And asking someone that who's stubborn is a challenge that we need to have because you want them to be smart. Stubbornness isn't necessarily bad, and it can be a virtue when it's called persistence. But sometimes, as history has shown, people do the right thing by remaining steadfast in their beliefs. And maybe that's great, especially if you're like a general and you know what you're doing is likely strategically the best choice you can make. Charles de Gaulle refused to admit defeat when France was overrun by Nazi Germany. And against overwhelming odds, he persuaded the French that they would ultimately prevail. And his unwavering belief in the greatness of the country helped him turn his vision into reality. It provided hope. Now, that is persistence. That is resiliency. Don't mistake that for stubbornness. At times, it's only being stubborn that we can bring a great idea to life. That can be a good thing, but once again, it's persistence. Stubbornness makes us persevere. It helps us stand our ground when everyone else is trying to tell us that we're wrong. And if it's used with discernment, which is what persistence involves, we can even argue that perseverance is stubbornness with a purpose. And that's what we want. Stubbornness with a purpose. But stubbornness alone is just stupidity. When there is an overwhelming evidence that we are wrong, but we still insist on staying our own course, we have to ask ourselves what motivates us to dig in our heels. What's happening in our inner world to make us do that? When dealing with stubborn person, we should not be fooled by outside appearances. Stubborn people may seem invincible, but there's a huge difference between a strong person and a stubborn person. Stubborn people protect strength and power. That's all they want. It's only a facade. Stubbornness is often a sign of insecurity and a way to hold on to very fragile mental equilibrium. Truly strong people know how to compromise when necessary, and that is a great quality. Stubborn people are often fearful of change, which explains the rigidity that characterizes a lot of their behavior. And on an unconscious level, they perceive attempts to change their mind as a personal attack. Thus, they're always on their guard, lashing out at anyone who tries to question their ideas. Instead of accepting new information or entertaining the possibility that someone else could be right, they prefer to argue their original point of view. Their insecurities make them ideal candidates for confirmation bias. And so they never really actualize relationships. They never really actualize the potential of what other people or other situations may offer because they only want to see it the way they see it. Stubbornness also touches on the dynamics of power. When stubborn people perceive a threat to their dignity, honor, pride, they may resort to power games in which there can only be winners and losers. And the idea that guides them is if I'm not stubborn, people would walk all over me. But stubbornness soon becomes a self-defeating exercise. Another characteristic of stubborn people is their tendency to categorize people as good or bad. Well, people are gray, and we need to understand that. Even the batshit crazy progressives and liberals and Democrats, all those batshit crazy people are still gray. There's good and bad in all of them. Depending on whether you agree with their ideas or not, there are some parts of them as a human being that we can all identify with. And, with a preference for simplistic black and white thinking, devoid of uncertainty and disagreement, stubborn people dig themselves in black and white thinking, which is the laziest form of thinking there possibly is. You are all this or you are all that. That is not the human race. That is not the earth. That's not how life operates. But these assholes got to put everything in a box and call it a day. Stubborn people's closed-mindedness. This behavior pattern comes to full fruition when it involves religions, ideologies, political philosophies, economics, and these embedded opinions in these areas are the hardest to change. They're more subject to personal judgment and idiosyncratic interpretation. And if you think about, like when the British changed their currency back to the pound, an issue around the political and economic ideologies trumped the reasoning. And that ended up being a kind of a crazy thing. Good, bad, or indifferent, it all happened. But the bottom line is, was it the best thing to do? Maybe not. All right, we're going to take another break and we're going to come right back. We're talking about stubbornness, and because stubbornness contributes to interpersonal conflict, stubborn people sometimes see a need to change. And in most instances, trying to change by themselves will be hard. So if they do seek help, whether from a significant other, family member, friend, colleague, professional advisor, that person had better possess a generous dose of empathy. Another thing that is very pervasive in our society today, I don't know if it's been around forever, but it sure looks like more of a phenomenon, is autism. We got a lot of it. These people are very stubborn. These people are all about right or wrong. and they are not about empathy whatsoever. And that can be a gift, and that can lead to higher intelligence, but it can also be a trait of stupidity. And unfortunately, when people hold on and are stubborn about the wrong things or about things that lead other people and down bad paths and hurt other people, these people can be very, very, very destructive. If you have a stubborn parent who never will apologize to their kids or their spouse, you've got a turd. That is an ultimate turd. And the best place for them to be is laying in the backyard with all the other dog turds. But unfortunately, these people breed and they take on the role of becoming a parent, and then they are too stubborn to even give their child the humility of an apology. If you can't do that, you have no right having kids. You have no right. What in the hell do you think you're doing? What an idiot. Keep it in your pants until you have the maturity to apologize and care about another human being. People that are stubborn, their instinctive fear of being controlled by others, you know, you got to tread lightly. They need to go with the flow and control any impulse to move directly against the defenses of a stubborn person. If you're a person like that, you are wise because you want to ebb and flow. Instead, they want to perform judo, the stubborn person. They want everything to come back to them. And so they resist people who want to have Socratic dialogue and other ideas and talk about things from all different perspectives. They can't stand it. It has to be, everything's a waste of time unless it's the truth that they believe in. You know, helpers, if you're a codependent, because stubborn people love codependent people, they have to be extremely careful not only about what to say, but when to say it. When the time's right to present a different opinion. And it should be done very respectfully with the stubborn person because they demand it. Even though they're some of the dumbest people on the planet, they demand respect. It's kind of sad. If you're in those kind of situations, you want to empathize with the stubborn person. Empathize with their stupidity. Empathize with the fact that they cannot change their perspective and understand it. Don't humiliate them for it. Understand it and try to understand where they're coming from. But doesn't mean you have to agree with it. People can only change if they are prepared to explore why they do what they do and discover different ways to deal with life. Some people will profit from being more aware of underlying issues behind their compulsion to be right. Through psychotherapy, coaching, they may come to recognize how their inadequately fueled rigidity has complicated their lives. And they may discover that their need for argument and conflict is not necessary. And they may learn to appreciate the value of looking at issues from different perspectives. That's called intellect. They may even start to appreciate ambiguity. They may slowly unlearn old defense mechanisms and replace them with more constructive ones. Here in the United States, our education system breeds narcissism because it has grades. It has how right are you? And that is not how to learn. How to learn is to sit in a classroom, have read a book, and everybody talk about their perspective about what they learned from the book, and each person to learn from what other people learned. And therefore, you accumulate data from other people and assimilate the book not only through your own read, but through their reads. That's real education. That's an Oxford education. That's a Harvard education. That's people that actually get higher learning. Now, unfortunately, in the United States, we have all these universities that even Harvard, where they don't teach that way. They teach by the need to be right rather than the need to understand. And that's a really sad thing because they've hired all these crazy ass professors from other countries rather than the United States to tell you how to run your country, tell you how your politics should be, tell you how your religion should be, and tell you how your life should be. And so these kids paying 80,000 a year are being brainwashed by these international idiots who think they're right about everything because those people are stubborn that are teaching the kids. And it's sad. It's sad because we don't have a Socratic method in the United States to teach children. And if we did, we'd have a hell of a lot more smarter population. Stubborn people are defined by, this unwillingness to change. They tend to cling to their beliefs and reject new information. You know, they have a fear of the unknown, and it acts as a defense mechanism. They feel more comfortable and secure inside their established habits. They also have difficulty admitting they made a mistake. Why is it so hard to say, yeah, I screwed up. Yeah, I probably was wrong there. You know, I'm really sorry that you see me this way, or I'm really sorry that I hurt your feelings. I didn't mean to hurt your feelings. I could see how you think about me that way. What if we were a little more humble? Wouldn't that be nice? Wouldn't that be nice if people are a little bit more like that? Stubborn personality disorder is not an official diagnosis. But extreme and psychological rigid behavior is a hallmark of several recognized personality disorders. It mostly attaches itself to obsessive compulsive personality disorder, which is defined by an obsessive need for perfection, control, an inflexible adherence to rules. Then there's pathological stubbornness, where a person refuses to change their mind. They admit they're wrong or compromise. Even when presented with very clear evidence, it's often a defense mechanism. And when it crosses the line from annoying to a mental health concern, it typically points towards one of the following disorders. Once again, the obsessive compulsive personality disorder, the narcissistic personality disorder, which is marked by inflated sense of self-importance, a lack of empathy. Narcissists don't even know they're narcissists. They view any disagreement as a direct personal attack and will stubbornly double down on their perspectives and project their ego. Now, the worst one, the more destructive one, is the borderline personality disorder. And these people rarely accept the diagnosis that they are this. But people with BPD experience intense emotional instability, rapidly fluctuating self images, and their stubbornness stems from black and white thinking and an underlying intense fear of instability or abandonment. And so what they do is they stubbornly attach to one thing and then they change their mind and attach to another thing and then they attach to another thing and they do it all very stubbornly and very obstinately. Understanding the root cause of this rigidity is really important, as the approach to managing it differs significantly. In a lot of cases, it's deeply rooted in their neurological, genetic wiring rather than simply being a choice or an upbringing. Your child may be stubborn because they're asserting their growing need for autonomy, exploring their identity. It is a part of our developmental growth. You know, children lack fully developed impulse control and emotional regulation, so what feels like defiance is often just a normal developmental milestone or a struggle to communicate. They want autonomy. We have to remember that when we're raising our kids. So it's not necessarily stubbornness, it's more of the sense of need of object constant. That is a part of them. Highly sensitive natures. Many strong-willed children are deeply intuitive and inwardly motivated. They're highly attuned to their surroundings and often react defensively if they feel their opinions are being neglected. So they become very sensitive. That's a sign that a kid is moving towards stubborn. What you want them to be is resilient rather than stubborn. Also, the brain's processing. Kids heavily rely on their inner wisdom rather than outside authority, and that can get them into a lot of trouble. And so, what we have to understand is, as parents, if you're going to be some egotistical, stubborn person, teaching your kid developmentally who's going to be a stubborn person how to be more stubborn, you're really not helping them developmentally. You need to negotiate life. You need to be an influence in life. You need to not be the one dictating outcomes in life. You are not God. You are here to live amongst us, not to rule us. Managing traits about power struggle, you have to, look at some strategies. Number one, you want to offer controlled choices. You want to empower your kid. You can do the bad thing. If you do the bad thing, here's the consequence. You can do the good thing, and here's the reward. You can also listen and partner instead of giving commands as a stubborn, turdly parent is. Pause, listen to their point of view, help them build their reasoning and communication skills. Stubborn people are lazy, so they're going to shove their ideas down their kids' throats and just expect them to do what they told them to do, rather than for the kid to expand their mind. You also want to explain why to your kids. Kids often respond better to logical explanations of rules rather than simple because I said so directives. This is an important thing. And if you're going to be in a relationship, it's important to stand your ground. Here's what I can do, here's what I can't do. But if you're a yes no person, no, I won't do that. Yes, I will do that. Okay, if you're going to be a no person, you're a stubborn person. If you're going to be a what I can do and what I can't do, you're a person about having a relationship. There's a fine line between being assertive and stubborn. And this applies to all relationships. And it is a line that you want to always be assertive so you have boundaries, but you do not want to be stubborn. The issue of stubbornness is a pervasive problem. Talk about not sexy. Stubborn people are not sexy. I don't care how nice looking you are. If you're stubborn, you are ugly. Ugly inside and gonna be ugly on the outside because people can't stand you. You may have all the looks, but if you're stubborn, you're not a cooperative person. You're not a person to join life. You you want everything to come your way. Not such a good idea. And actually, it's not very mature because there's a likelihood you're still stuck in your own childhood. Tension and conflict occur in relationships because you and your partner are unwilling to compromise, agree or disagree. What you have to be in a relationship is willing to hear and understand your partner's perception of the truth. And if it's about you, even better so, to learn how they see you. This is how we have relationships. We accept the fact that we see each other differently. We accept the fact that we see ideas differently. We accept the fact that different things are meaningful to each other, and we strive to understand that. That is what a relationship requires. One of the best ways to overcome stubbornness is to understand why you are being stubborn. Once you have a clear understanding of the cause, it'll be easier for you to find ways to deal with it. So, for instance, if your partner wants to discipline your child and spank them or take something away from them, and you're afraid that you're going to lose their relationship with you. And so, since your fear is my child will not love me if we discipline them, and the other ones, they're never going to learn anything if we don't discipline them, these two people are going to have a stubborn conflict because one's convinced they're going to lose their child's love, and the other's convinced the kid's never going to learn anything. If you learn the meaning of why you guys are taking the stance, you're going to have a better shot at identifying the problem and meeting a middle ground. Identifying and accepting anything negatively impacting your relationship is an excellent way to start dealing with an issue. What causes stubbornness? Some very big probable causes are in relationships are very obvious. It stems from a place of self-image. You may be headstrong about something because you feel like that's just who you are as a person. Another reason might be, a lot of these white liars, a lot of people that white lie are hugely stubborn because they, blew smoke up their parents' ass when they were younger and they managed their image with their parents by lying and telling white lies and then they carry that into their marriage. Isn't that lovely? Wow, talk about integrity. You need to grow up and stop white lying, but the bottom line is trying to control your self-image in a relationship, there's only going to be one person in the relationship, and that's you with yourself because nobody's going to put up with that crap. Another reason might be because you and your partner believe that being stubborn may be the only way to fulfill your needs or desires. Maybe you've taken advantage of in the past. Maybe you've been traumatized by people violating you in the past. Well, that's nice, But the deal is, if you're going to take the responsibility to be in a relationship, you also have the responsibility to get over it, solve it, go to therapy, and learn how to be an understanding human being that you need to compromise with other people. There's also a chance that you and your partner both view acts of negotiation or compromise as a weakness, as a win, when in reality, it is a strength. Everybody wins. Both of you win. Don't you want both of you to win? That's important. Gosh, these stubborn people, they want it all to go their way. They think that's gratifying and sexy. No, it's not. Why are you even in a relationship? Go live in a cabin in the woods and be that. You know, we have to confront stubbornness in this society because all it does is continue to beget stupidity. And that is not good for the human race. All right, that's our show. I want to thank everybody for listening. I love hearing from you. You can do that on our webpage, voiceamericamedia.com, or libsyn, libsyn.com, Dr. Gary Bell's Absurd Psychology. Now remember, stubborn people are deeply lonely, but won't take the initiative. Also, stubborn people are too proud to forgive and refuse to apologize. Also, stubborn people believe they are always right, but act like they care about